Welcome to Ancient Philosophy, Lecture 3 on the Apology. So I hope you have been following along and have enjoyed the lectures so far. The lecture on the Euthyphro introduced us to the method that Socrates uses to engage his interlocutors, and we learned a little bit about the nature of the Socratic quest, what Socrates is after. He wants an account of what justice is. In the case of the Euthyphro, it starts off with the nature of impiety. He doesn't want just a list of actions. He wants necessary and sufficient conditions for piety, for justice, in a way where those necessary and sufficient conditions explain. They have explanatory depth. They give us an understanding of what justice is. So today we turn to Plato's Apology, which is an absolute masterpiece. So you're going to really enjoy reading and thinking through the Apology. In the Apology, what we see is Plato's defense of Socrates. It's an account of Socrates' speech before an Athenian jury. So let's go ahead and get started with some introductory material to the Apology. So over here on your right-hand screen, you see a pictorial. I'll move this over here for a minute. You'll see a pictorial representation of what an Athenian jury would look like. You would have an individual down on the floor and would be looking up to the seats where there would be, this is a very small picture, it would be like a huge auditorium that would be capable of filling at least 500 seats. If you go visit Athens and you go to the Parthenon, you can see what one of these auditoriums would look like. All right. So, as I said, the Apology is Socrates' main speech, defending himself against the legal charges that were brought against him. And what we want to think about is like, what were the charges that were brought against Socrates, and sort of what motivated those. And then look at Socrates' Defense, which introduces us more to the figure of Socrates, but also introduces us to the practice of philosophy and some very distinctive Socratic claims, which will be important to think about. And we also want to think about, like, what is the larger purpose of the Apology? Why did Plato write the Apology? One of the things to note about these Platonic dialogues is a lot of scholars think that they were continually worked over and over and over. And in this case, with the Apology, we can be really confident about this because it's just an absolute masterpiece. It's not the sort of thing that, Plato would have just, completed on a first draft. So just FYI, as you're thinking about your papers, you want to think, these are the kinds of things that, you have an idea, you write it down, you think about it some more, you improve the idea, you continue to work on your paper. Take as inspiration the great masters who, through patience and hard work, continue to hone their skill, continue to develop their ideas, and try to express them as best they can in written form. So the Athenian jury consisted of 501 Athenian citizens, and from the Apology, the decisions were based on majority vote. The Apology itself breaks down into 3 segments. The first segment is Socrates' main speech. And as we talked about with the Euthyphro, these little numbers refer to the authoritative text of Plato's writings. You can find these on the columns, right? So 17a to 35d is the main speech. Socrates' reply to the ruling is shorter, 35b to 38b. And then Socrates' final words to the jury and to his friends, 38c and 42a. So how should we read the Apology? Well, we live in an age of quick results, fast food, speed reading techniques. Everything needs to be done at an accelerated pace. Philosophers, by and large, want to resist this because some ideas and some conversation should happen very slow. It takes a long time right, to sort of grapple with an idea and to get it, right, in the proper, sort of integration with the rest of your thinking. So I would really encourage you to read through the Apology once, just to get a sense, mark what you find really interesting about the Apology. If there are particular passages that you want to go back to, go back to those and read them aloud. So what we'll do as we're going through this lecture is we'll pause every now and then, and we'll read a passage aloud, and we'll think about, what's being said there. There is definitely something to reading slow, reading out loud, letting, right, this full experience of your eyes seeing the words and your ears hearing the words and your mouth articulating the words, let that full experience sort of wash over you as you grapple with what Socrates is saying. So I'd encourage you to read it first, read passages out loud, read it a second time. I don't remember how many times I've read the Apology, but each time I read the Apologies, I find there's a new aspect to it that I didn't know before. So, even this time, as I was preparing this lecture, I read through the Apology again. I sat in my beach chair on my deck and just enjoyed the experience of reading the Apology. And what I hope you find is that with many of the Platonic dialogues and many of the passages that we'll read in Aristotle, that they're a real joy to read and to think about. So, there's lots of ways to spend your time, but a very good way to spend your time is to read a little philosophy and talk to your friends about philosophy. So the Apology itself is very influential. I just wanted to give you a taste of its influence. So Martin Luther King, his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, just down the road from us here at Tuscaloosa, appealed to Socrates several times. So you can find this letter online, and a good exercise is just to go, Control F, put up the find menu, type in Socrates and see how many times Martin Luther King talks about Socrates in this letter. So here's one passage that Martin Luther King reminds the readers about what Socrates did, and especially the presentation of the Apology. So Martin Luther King writes, just as Socrates felt it necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective proposal, so must we see the need for non-violent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So as we begin our study of the Apology, I hope these words will also be true for you. So we're going to begin our study of the Apology now. So let's flip over to the next slide. All right. So what we see here in our picture is a picture of the temple at Delphi. So I'll move my video feed over for a minute so you can see that. And what would happen is you would have a priestess or a goddess in the middle, the ring there. It would be like a platform. And people would go, right, to inquire from the Delphic oracle, and she would, or he would issue their pronouncements. So what happens in this story of the Apology is that Socrates' friend goes to the oracle at Delphi and asks the oracle, who's the wisest person there is? Is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle issues this pronouncement, says no one is wiser than Socrates. So Socrates, right, is really puzzled by this remark. Right, so let's look at this passage. So if you have the 5 Dialogues book for this reading, we're on page 26. But as before, there are lots of different translations, lots of different books that publish these. So the easiest way to find this is to refer to the little numbers on the side. So if we look at 21b, so we see 22 down there, and we can go backwards to 21b. This is what Socrates says. Consider that I tell you this, because I would inform you about the origin of this slander. When I heard of this reply, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? They're referring to the oracle of Delphi. What is his riddle? I am very conscious that I am not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? So Socrates here in public. Not wise, he thinks. For surely he does not lie, and it's not legitimate for him to do so. For a long time I was at a loss to his meaning. Then, very reluctantly, turned to such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed ones, thinking that they would, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say to it, this man is wiser than I. But you said I was. Right? So remember, the charge against Socrates is that he's charged with sort of disrupting the social order. He's charged with corrupting the youth and not in believing the gods of Athens. Right? So these are corrupting the youth, not believing in the gods. Is very much like a contemporary. We would think about this contemporary as someone who's going to corrupt society and is bad for morals, has a bad character. Right? So we see these kind of slanderous accusations made throughout contemporary politics. So Socrates hears the oracle and says, this is really puzzling. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refute the oracle. I'm going to go find a county temple. I'm going to find someone that's wiser than me. And then I'm going to take this person back to the oracle and say, see, look, there's someone who has a lot of wisdom. I don't have any wisdom, so this person's wiser than me, so you're wrong. I'm not the wisest person. All right, so Socrates is on his quest. So this is what he does. So he goes and finds a person and says, then, when I examine this man, there's no need for me to tell you who it is. You probably don't know who he is, right? He says, my experience went like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. As a result, he came to dislike me, and so did many of the bystanders. It's a very common experience, right? Socrates goes to someone who has a public reputation of being intelligent, right? Investigates them on some very fundamental questions. So we can again think about the connection with Euthyphro. Euthyphro, remember, is an esteemed priest who's prosecuting his father for murder, and Socrates goes to investigate him about the nature of piety, and finds out that the person doesn't really understand, right? How to answer some fundamental questions about what piety is. Right? So Socrates is doing this. He's going and picking out esteemed leaders of the city and pointing out that they really don't have the kind of wisdom that Socrates is looking for. So, as you can imagine, this is not a good way to, gain friends, to influence people and such. So, after this encounter, right, Socrates has, in a way, angered, right, a very influential public individual, and has frustrated the bystanders who are, listening to this exchange. So he says, I withdrew and thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know, so I am likely to be wiser than he to this small extent. I do not think I know what I do not know. Right? So this is referred to as Socratic wisdom. Right? So Socrates is of the opinion that he's wiser than this individual in this really small respect. So this other individual thinks he has knowledge. And Socrates is at least wise enough to realize that he doesn't have any right? So he continues, right, this investigation for a while. He goes to the poets, to the politicians, to the writers. You should think about this. He goes to the culturally and politically influential leaders in the city. These are people that are reputed, right, for their wisdom. And Socrates investigates them on some very fundamental questions, having to do with justice and goodness, these things that you would think people should be able to answer. So what is it? If he goes to a poet, right, you might ask the poet about the nature of poetry. What it is that, what were you trying to do when you wrote this poem? What aim did you have in mind? What good were you seeking? And what is good? How do you know what the good is? And what Socrates found with his cultural leaders is that they didn't have good answers to these very fundamental questions. And so he angered a lot of people. And, as you all know, when you begin to frustrate, anger people in authority, most likely what they're going to do is try to figure out a way where they can remove, right, that kind of pain and go back to what they're normally accustomed to doing. So there is one aspect here that I want to highlight. So Socrates goes to the cultural leaders, right, and the politicians, and finds that they don't have wisdom. Now he went. Notice on what is this? This is 22d. He goes to the craftsman. Right? So he says, Socrates says, well, look, I'm going to go to the craftsman because I know nothing, and I hope to find some knowledge among the craftsmen. Now note that he says, I wasn't mistaken, the craftsmen have knowledge. Right? So they know, craftsmen know how to perform, if the craftsman is a dancer, for example, they know how to perform and allow them to dance. If the craftsman is, a candle maker, they know how to make candles. If the craftsman is, a glass maker, they know how to make glass. And Socrates finds that they do indeed possess this knowledge, but note what he finds. He finds that the people who are good craftsmen, right, seem to have in a way the same fault that the poets have. He says each of them, because of his success at his craft, thought himself very wise in most other pursuits. Right? So Socrates finds in the craftsman, he finds knowledge, but he doesn't find the wisdom. Right? So this is a distinction, right, that we want to think about later. What is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? So that's a really important distinction between knowledge and wisdom, and we'll return to that in a bit. Notice this puzzling remark we find about Socratic wisdom is that Socrates is the wisest because he understands that his wisdom is worthless. Right? So you'll note that at the beginning of the Apology, Socrates conceives of himself in a way of having kind of a human wisdom. There's a sort of humility, right, with this Socratic wisdom. Now, there's a question whether this is in a way ironic. Socrates, as you read through, doesn't strike you as someone who's lacking in confidence about his ability to get at fundamental questions about reality. So, we want to keep sort of in mind, right, this sort of ironic understanding of what Plato is up to here with Socrates. So let's look at the next part of Socrates' defense. And so this is where he responds to Miletus. Okay. So here's another picture alleged of Socrates, right, before the Athenian jury. Keep in mind that it's not accurate. It would have to be presented to a much larger audience. So Socrates is concerned to reply to Miletus's charges that he corrupts the youth and doesn't believe in the Athenian gods. And what we want to do is we're going to look at a part of this speech. This is a good part to sort of pause and reflect over, to read out loud, to sort of get a sense of what it would be like to listen to Socrates' response. So Socrates says, starting at 28 AD, he said, "This is the truth of the matter, men of Athens. Whenever a man has taken a position that he believes to be best, or has been placed by his commander, there he must remain and face danger, without a thought for death or anything else, rather than disgrace." So this, is Socrates saying, look, if you have a position that you think is best, or if someone commands you to take that position, right, then you're obligated to yourself to stand your ground, to take that position. Right? So, he continues on talking a little bit about his war experience in the earlier 30 Years' War, about he would stand his ground, and defend it with honor. For Socrates, something that's really important is honor and dishonor. Right? If you take a position that you think is best, and yet you don't represent yourself in having that position, then there's in his view, that's dishonorable. There's a kind of internal sort of incoherence in your views. Right? So he says that would have been a dreadful thing to do, to abandon one's position. And then I might truly have been justly brought here for not believing that there are gods, disobeying the oracle, fearing death, and thinking I am wise when I am not. To fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows when one does not. No one knows whether death may be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet fear it as they knew that is the greatest of evils. And surely it is the most blameworthy ignorance to believe that one knows when one does not know. It is perhaps on this point, and in this respect, gentlemen, that I differ from the majority of men. And if I were to claim that I am wiser than anyone in anything, it would be in this, that as I have no adequate knowledge of things in the underworld, so I do not think that I have this knowledge. I do know, however, that it is wicked and shameful to do wrong, to disobey one's superior, be he God or man. When Socrates continues on in this speech, I encourage you to read it out loud. I want to just look at the end of this speech on the following page. Right? So he ends this particular part of his speech by saying that wealth does not bring about excellence, but excellence makes wealth and everything else good for men, both individually and collectively. So what I hope you can see in this, just looking at this particular part of Socrates' speech, is something of the character that Socrates has and that Plato represents Socrates as having. So Socrates is someone that is concerned, we might say, with interior matters. We might say with the soul, with the person. But he's of the mindset that an inordinate concern for material possessions, for status, for wealth, for power, really corrupts what is most best about an individual. What we'll see in a bit, is how Socrates is going to respond to some of the calls and what he should do after the jury reaches their verdict. So let's continue on. So what we see here, is a picture of Socrates about to drink the hemlock. So this is a scene that we'll refer back to when we read the Phaedo in here. All right, so Socrates ends his speech, and we find that the jury votes, and they sentence Socrates to death. Now, what's interesting, Socrates notes, is that the decision was rather small. So he says 30 votes would have made the difference, right? And if you do the arithmetic, right, the jury would have voted 265 people for, right, sentencing Socrates to death, and 236 people opposing this sentence. So how does Socrates respond? Now it's just a great response. So I encourage you to read it. Socrates basically tells, right, the Athenian jury that his response, his counter suggestion to the sentence of death, is that they parade him around the city as an Olympic victor. They provide food for life. They provide housing for life. They allow him to walk unencumbered around the city to continue in his conversations. Right? And as he's closing, right, his remarks, right, people may ask Socrates, well, Socrates, instead of accepting the sentence of death from the court, could you just be quiet? Just leave the city and stop asking these fundamental and annoying questions. Can't you do that? Just on vacation, right? I mean, we know Socrates is already, he's 70 years old. He's towards the end of his life. Maybe it's a good time to just retire and to move on. Right? You've angered a lot of people. They've been so angry they've taken you to court. Right? The court has just ruled, right, that you're guilty of corrupting with the youth and not believing in the gods, right? And they have sentenced you to death. So time for a vacation. But this is what Socrates says. He says, perhaps someone might say, "Hey, Socrates, can you just take a break? Can you just leave quietly, please?" Right? Now, Socrates responds, "This is the most difficult point on which I want to convince some of you. If I say that it's impossible for me to keep quiet because that means disobeying the God, you will not believe me and will think I am being ironical. On the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for men to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living." So that quote is one that you will hear over and over again. The unexamined life is not worth living. And that's something that we want to think about. I mean, Socrates says right here that the greatest good for a person is to discuss virtue every day. And these other items, matters that you hear me conversing about, the nature of justice, the nature of knowledge, the nature of the state, and so on. And so I want you to think about that. We'll return to this over and over again. Okay? So the Athenian jury reconvenes, right, considers Socrates' response to make him into an Olympic victor and offer him free food and housing and let him stay in Athens. And they say, no, we could have anticipated this. And Socrates is, again, the sentence is upheld, and so then he addresses, right, his, the jury in his friends. Right? And his response, is interesting. He has an argument here that it's not rational to fear death. I'll let you read that. This is an argument that we will also think about when we go to Plato. Plato is Socrates' last words. It's the ancient title was on the immortality of the soul. And so Socrates gives several arguments there that the soul is immortal, and that gives another argument very similar to this one, that it's irrational to fear death. But Socrates also talks about the problem here is that it's not difficult to run away from death. I mean, avoiding death is not difficult, Socrates says. Right? It's much more difficult to avoid wickedness. So again, Socrates is represented as someone that's deeply concerned with the state of the soul, with doing right. Remember, in the Apology, we haven't talked about it, but Socrates says he has this divine sign that in a way compels him, right, to act and question, right, in the way that he does, and that he has to be true to that. He has to be true to this seemingly mission that he has. Another place in the Apology he talks about, being sent to Athens just for this purpose. So, it's a really moving scene here where Socrates is representing himself as not being afraid of death, but being more afraid of not being true, right, to what is required for the flourishing, right, of his soul. Right, so as we move to an overall evaluation of the Apology, I want you to think about a few questions. Right, so Socrates is a political prisoner. He is convicted on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth. I think, how did Socrates corrupt the youth? He corrupted the youth by asking fundamental questions, by investigating, right, the nature of the state, the nature of goodness, the nature of knowledge, and so on, and getting sort of people to realize that they didn't have as firm of a grasp on some very fundamental matters as they represent, right, themselves as having. Right? So Socrates is a proponent in this context of ideas that are very dangerous to the ruling class of Athens. And so we want to think, are there, really ask, are there dangerous ideas? Are there ideas that are worth dying for? Now you might think, I will die for the love of my life. Well, that's a person, right? It's not an idea. Right? I think, the kind of unfettered inquiry, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? These are ideas. Right? These are not people. These kinds of things worth dying for. Now, Socrates in the Apology contrasts himself with the sophist, which we haven't talked about. Sophists are professional teachers that will teach you how to argue persuasively. Socrates contrasts himself with the sophist because the sophists, right, claim to have the skill of being able to teach you how to convince another person of any view you want to convince them of. Right? They're skilled in the art of persuasion. And Socrates says, look, I'm not interested in persuasion. I'm interested in the truth. Right? The goal of thought, the goal of inquiry, the goal of conversation, the goal of speech, of writing, Socrates thinks should be to get at the truth. It shouldn't be at persuasion. Right? So it's interesting that the Athenians, the Athenian ruling class, are threatened by Socrates' question. Which leads us to the next question about wisdom and ignorance. So, is wisdom more valuable than ignorance? And I'm sure that all of us would say, yes, of course, wisdom is more valuable than ignorance. Socrates represents himself as a gadfly, as I think here in Alabama, like a big horsefly that goes around and bites people. Right? In this case, the biting, the unpleasant experience, right, is Socrates pointing out that the individual lacks the kind of wisdom that they think they have. Well, if we value wisdom more than ignorance, why are we so off-put when someone points out that we're not as wise as we thought we were? It's a very unpleasant experience, having someone ask you very fundamental questions about something that you are deeply engaged in, and then realizing that you don't know these things that you thought, right, you knew. So how does that sit with, right, this thought that, we would love, right, to be wise rather than be ignorant, but when we have opportunities to realize that we're not as wise in a particular matter, then we thought or we respond with hostility. And so a related question to think about is, are you harmed by ignorance? Are you harmed by knowledge? Are you harmed by wisdom? Right? Think of someone who is very confident, right, in what they're doing, right? But they don't know the matter, right, at hand. Right? Are they harmed, right, by that ignorance? So that's something that I want you to think about, reflect on. I want to hear your thoughts about that. Right, so some final reflections. So one thing to ask is, why did Plato write the Apology? The Apology purports to be an account of Socrates' final speech before the Athenian court, defending his inquiry, his activity. So was Plato just concerned in here to be a reporter, right? Say, okay, I'm going to write this account, and I'm going to publish it as a dialogue. If there were newspapers, I would publish it as a newspaper, and people would read about Socrates' final speech. Or did Plato have another purpose? Or, different way to think about this question is, are there different ways of reading the Apology? Are there different purposes at play in the Apology? So let's recall back that remark that Martin Luther King had in his letter to the Birmingham jail, where he said, "We see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood." So one way to see what's going on in the Apology is it's not only an account of Socrates' defense before the Athenian jury, not only teaches us about who Socrates is, about the nature of philosophy, about the kinds of things that Socrates is concerned about. It is introducing us to a way of thinking about the purpose of human life, a way of thinking about the nature and the foundation of the state, so that, right, the nature and the foundation of the state and the human person can be based on inquiry and truth. The Apology is a great introduction to the rest of Plato's thought. So we will move on from here to read the Credo, which gives, in a way, Socrates' account of the state. We will talk about that in a few days. And then we'll move on to read the Meno and the Plato. We'll read the Theaetetus and Plato's Republic. And so what we want to do is keep in mind this political motivation, right, that we find in the Apology. So another sort of final reflection is that I want you to think about, what do you learn about Socrates from both, right, the Euthyphro and the Apology? What is the nature of Socratic dialogue? You definitely, from reading these two works, definitely get a much better picture of how Socrates, right, investigated these kinds of questions. That Socrates didn't sort of in a way shut himself right in a room. He engaged in people. He engaged them in conversation, really fundamental questions. So, think about the character, right, of Socrates, and think, is this the kind of person that you would enjoy, right, walking around town with? Is this the kind of person that you would want to go on a trip with, right? Is this the kind of person that you would want to have, right, as a teacher, right? So next up, right, the Credo. The Credo is basically, this setup. Socrates' friends, they visit him in jail and they say, Socrates, man, we got this elaborate plan. We can get you out of Athens. You won't have to drink the hemlock. You won't have to die. Come live with us. And it's Socrates' response to that question. So Plato is fascinating, really fun dialogue to read. So look forward to talking to you